And we have an inspiring UN Secretary General, António Guterres, who was appointed following the most transparent and inclusive process in UN history, which UNA UK played a small part in bringing about. Mr. Guterres took up his position on the 1st of January this year, and he brings a wealth of experience to the job. He served for 10 years as UN High Commissioner for Refugees, heading one of the world's foremost humanitarian organizations during some of the most serious displacement crises in decades. Before joining UNHCR, he spent more than 20 years in government and public service. He was first elected to the Portuguese Parliament in 1976 and served as Prime Minister from 1995 to 2002, during which time he was heavily involved in the international effort to resolve the crisis in East Timor. As President of the European Council in early 2000, he led the adoption of the Lisbon Agenda for Growth and Jobs and co-chaired the first ever European Union Africa Summit. He was active in the Socialist International, serving as its president from 1999 to 2005, and is currently a member of the Club of Madrid, a leadership alliance of democratic former presidents and prime ministers from around the world. He is fluent in Portuguese, English, French, and Spanish. Secretary General, when UNA UK co-founded the 1 for 7 billion campaign to transform the selection process for your post, our aim was to find the best possible person to lead the UN at this turbulent time. And we believe our campaign succeeded. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage the Secretary General of the United Nations, António Guterres.
Thank you very much. Dear friends, it's an enormous pleasure to be here. The UN Association of the United Kingdom is one of the pillars of the support of the global public opinion to the United Nations, and the UK is also one of the strongest pillars of multilateralism and one of the most solid supports of the United Nations action around the world. So my first word is very simple. Thank you very much to all of you, to the British government, to the British people, to the UN Association. I could say, beginning this intervention, that the world has never been better than now. And it would not be very difficult to make the case with a series of arguments. But that is only part of the truth. So I would probably more properly concentrate on what I consider to be the three main challenges that we are facing in the world today, seen from the perspective of the UN, the kind of reforms that we need to be able to address these challenges, and the strategies that those reforms should allow us to put in place. First challenge is in relation to conflict. Again, it's true that we could argue that the world has never been more in peace than today. The number of soldiers killed in combat is at the lowest level ever. But it is also because the nature of conflict has changed. As it was said, we no longer have wars between countries. We essentially have internal conflicts with a multiplicity of actors of different natures, normally with asymmetric character, but internal conflicts that became quickly regionalized and sometimes even globalized. And those conflicts that have been multiplying in the recent years are more and more interlinked, more and more complex, and more linked to what it is now, a new global threat of terrorism that is impacting the whole world and cannot be neglected by anyone, anywhere. Now, why is it so? In my opinion, there are two main reasons for that. First, power relations in the world became less clear. And as power relations become less clear, impunity and predictability tend to prevail. Actors in different settings tend to do whatever they want, knowing that probably they will not be punished for that. And we see our behaviors of different actors in different conflicts systematically violate international humanitarian law, human rights, with the belief that nothing will happen to them, that there will be no accountability for their crimes. On the other hand, we see that in a context in which there is enormous progress globally, fragility has also increased in a number of relevant parts of the world. And fragility of different sorts. Fragility of political nature in relation to governance, corruption, institutions that are too weak to be able to make a country work and make progress. Difficulties in the relationship between communities of different religions, of different cultures, but also economic fragilities, the difficulty to respond to external shocks, be them related to climate change or to economic crisis. And this fragility that we see in so many countries in the world has been the cause for many conflicts to erupt, and then a major problem to allow us to solve those conflicts. Now, when one looks at this fragility, it's also important to recognize that even if the global economy has been progressing, and even if the global economic situation in the world has always improved, the truth is that we see a number of global megatrends that interact with each other, and interact with each other in a way that enhances those fragilities that I mentioned. Population growth, climate change, chaotic forms of urbanization, namely in the developing world, large movements of population, food insecurity, water scarcity. All these things are becoming more and more interlinked also in a world that is smaller and smaller, and they tend to have devastating consequences in different parts of the world, the most fragile ones, creating more sources of fragility and increasing the negative impact of that fragility in relation to peace and security in different regions of our planet. And on the same time, the truth is that we are witnessing a lack of trust between the general public, between peoples, and political establishments, but also international organizations like the UN. Many people doubt that multilateralism is the solution for the global problems of this time. They think that probably the best way is to allow each country to do it by itself. And when one looks at globalization, it is clear that globalization has generated, together with technological progress, enormous increase in global wealth and in global trade, that globalization has had a very positive impact in the well-being of the overwhelming majority of the population in the world, that the number of absolute poor has been considerably reduced. But at the same time, it is also true that globalization and technological progress have contributed to increased inequality, in some situations in a very dramatic way, and has left people behind. In all processes, there are winners and losers. And we have the rust belts of this world in which people feel abandoned and feel not only that globalization has worked against them, but that political establishments, international organizations have not been able to address their plight, to solve their problems, and they feel angry, and they express that anger in different ways, at national level, but also in different ways in relation to a clear criticism in relation to the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other multilateral organizations around the world. Now, if we want to be able to overcome this lack of confidence, and to overcome this lack of confidence is absolutely crucial to rescue multilateralism and to make sure that multilateralism, that is more necessary than ever, as problems are becoming more global than ever, can move forward, we need to have a strong commitment to reform multilateral organizations. And one of those is the UN. And so I do believe that it is absolutely essential to introduce a very solid program of reforms in the United Nations. First of all, with the logic of integration. We are very segmented, we are very fragmented in the way we deal with the problems of the world. We have three pillars: peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. But the truth is that these three pillars are dealt with in different ways, with different organizations, with different objectives, and sometimes even with contradictory approaches. It is for me absolutely clear that there is, and this is an old sentence, no peace without development, no development without peace. It is more and more recognized that there is no peace and development without human rights, But the truth is that there is no way to address these problems if we don't do it in an integrated way. If we are not simultaneously responding to the challenges we face in peace and security, in sustainable and inclusive development, and in human rights, and giving responses with our strategies, with our programs, with the action of our organizations that combine the three approaches into one single program of action. This integration approach must be the center of all strategies of reform that we implement in the United Nations. And in relation to that, we have three strands, but three strands that we want to make converge in one only line of reform. First, to reform the UN development system, to reform the way the groups of agencies that exist and that act everywhere in the world work together and are able not only to coordinate effectively what they do, avoiding overlaps and filling gaps, but that they accept a much more clear accountability, not only in relation to what each one does in accordance to its mandate, but in relation to what each one does to serve the objectives of the collective action of the UN in support to member states and in support to the Sustainable Development Goals, to the Paris Agreement on climate change, and the other very important instruments we have in order to make our planet move forward in the right direction. This is a central area, and linked to this area is the capacity to bring together the humanitarian and the development areas of action of the United Nations. Obviously, we need to preserve the humanitarian space and its autonomy. But it is clear when one looks at the situations around the world that it's essential not only to address the humanitarian crisis, but to build resilience of populations, of regions and countries, and to create the conditions for those humanitarian crises not to be repeated. And the only way to do so is to link development with humanitarian response and to make sure that humanitarian response creates the conditions to be sustainable and not to force new crises one after the other, always making us respond in a way that might be effective in addressing the needs of the moment, but doesn't solve the problem of the people that we need to support. This coordination between development and humanitarian, that also means a much stronger coordination between the United Nations and international financial institutions and other multilateral organizations, is an absolute must in the way we are now looking into our reform process and the reorganization of the way we do business. But for this to work, we also need to look seriously into the architecture of our peace operations and of our structures that serve those peace operations. The UN is particularly known for its peacekeeping effort. It represents 70 to 80%, depending on the period, of the financial resources the UN uses. But the traditional peacekeeping blue helmet operation that was conceived for a situation in which the parties to the conflict would come to an agreement, and it was necessary to consolidate that agreement and create a condition for stability in order for the country to be able to move forward in a positive way based on the peace that had been established. That formula is practically non-existent in today's world. And we have more and more peacekeeping operations where there is little peace to keep. And we have simultaneously, in the case of Mali, for instance, a peacekeeping operation together with a counter-terrorism operation. We have many situations in which we have to define a robust peacekeeping approach, in which peacekeepers are also supposed to fight against some spoilers, some terrorists or rebel groups that do not allow for a peace process to move forward. And this has created a number of challenges that put into question the normal way that the UN had to do business and the nature of the structures and the capacities that we have and the kind of partnerships that are necessary to face the new realities. And so another area of reform that is closely linked to the first one because we need to align the sustainable development and the sustaining peace approaches. A second line is in relation to the architecture of our peace operations and the structural architecture of our political and peace dimensions at the Secretariat of the UN. And linked to these, we have two processes already in place with two proposals in the General Assembly. One, reforming our counterterrorism structure, linked to both counterterrorism and to the prevention of violent extremism. And second, a new program of action with important structural changes in relation to the sexual exploitation and abuse, as we recognize that independently of the dramas created to the victims, which of course are the first reason for us to act, this is also a most important source of reputational risk for an organization like the UN. It is totally unacceptable that those that are supposed to protect people are perpetrators of sexual violence in the context in which they operate. But for all these reforms to work, we need to make sure that our management processes change. And there is where we have the biggest difficulty, because if there was a conspiracy to make sure that staff rules, budget rules, financial rules were established for the UN to make the UN non-operational, if that conspiracy would exist, it had produced exactly the result we have today. The rules that we have to respect in the way we do business are the product of an accumulation during decades of situations of mistrust between member states that led to a logic of micromanagement in which, for instance, I am not allowed to create one position, a technical position in one office in Geneva, for instance, without going to the General Assembly and having the consensus of 193 countries. And the same to abolish that position. That shows how absurd our rules are and how needed is the reform, but how important it is to create among member states the belief that that reform is necessary, because for many member states this micromanagement capacity is something that they like to have because they give them the illusion of power. And as we know, those that have been in politics for some years, we know that sometimes we live much more with the illusion of power than with power itself. And the illusion of power has been a major motivation in relation to the absurd mechanisms that we have that undermine our capacity to act effectively. We need simplification, decentralization, we need flexibility, but we need transparency and accountability in what we do. And the kind of agreement I want to establish with member states is exactly that one. Give us more responsibility, give us more freedom of movement, but we are going to be more transparent and more accountable to you in relation to what we do and in relation to the forms in which we act. And the objectives for these are very simple. Reform is not something that we do for itself. Reform is something that we do in order to be able to have strategies that are more linked to the needs of the people we care for and to the aspirations of that people. And one of the things that is clear is that we need to substantially increase our capacity of prevention, of mediation, and of conflict resolution. And that requires an investment in our own capacities, an investment in partnerships with regional organizations. Tomorrow the African Union will be here together with us in relation to Somalia. Other regional organizations are extremely important. We need to be able also to work much better with the private sector and with the civil society in creating the conditions for prevention to be effective, because much of the prevention of conflict lies in economic and social development. Much of the prevention of conflict lies in the capacity of human rights to be respected, and we need to be able to put all those capacities together and all the actors that are relevant acting in cooperation in these regards. And at the same time, we need to be able to look into our peace operations and to create conditions for them to be more effective, more nimble, and with more capacity to use modern technologies, and with more links to the people they are supposed to serve in order to avoid the kind of abuses I mentioned, and in order to make sure that they become strong elements, not only solving conflicts, not only reestablishing peace, but creating the conditions for that peace to be sustainable. Then a second very important area for us will be to make the UN effective in supporting member states, especially fragile states or least developed countries, to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are a very ambitious program. They correspond, in my opinion, to a breakthrough in the sense that it was possible to unite the international community with a universal vision and with a comprehensive approach to inclusive and sustainable development. But it's a complex process. It's not easy to explain, and it's not easy to use as a mobilizing tool in relation to all the actors that we need to bring together. Again, civil society, public sector, governments, international organizations. And the UN needs to have the capacity, especially at country level, with a much more coordinated and effective action at country level, supporting governments to make things happen, to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals are integrated in the normal budgeting and planning processes of countries and are assumed by countries as their own national objectives. For that, we need to have a much more effective set of tools on the ground, a much more effective cooperation among our own agencies and the other actors in the economic and humanitarian fields. And this is the reason of the reform of the UN development system that I mentioned, and of the interlinkage between the development and the humanitarian dimensions of our organizations and of our actions. At the same time, there is a global battle for or against climate change. And a battle in which we need to mobilize all resources and all capacities. We see some doubts emerging, namely in a country that is extremely relevant for world affairs. It is absolutely crucial to mobilize governments to stay the course, to mobilize societies, to mobilize the business community. And I think that we have now a very important ally, because the green economy became the good economy, the profitable economy. Green business became good business. And this is one reason why I am optimistic in relation to the capacity, even when governments are doubtful, even when governments may consider that climate change is not a problem to deal with. I'm optimistic about the capacity to mobilize civil societies, business communities, cities, regions, all the other countries, in order to make sure that what was agreed in Paris is implemented and that we are able to face this very dramatic challenge that could alter in a terrible way the living conditions in our planet, especially in the most vulnerable regions of that planet. And one needs not do more but to look at the Sahel or to look at Somalia today and to see how droughts are becoming more frequent, more intense and with more dramatic consequences, to understand that this is something that needs to mobilize the whole of the international community. And the UN needs to be able to make the case and needs to be able to work in support of governments and needs to be able to work in advocacy but also in the mobilization of resources that are absolutely essential for climate change. And then another crucial battle. We are seeing the human rights agenda losing ground to the national sovereignty agenda. And it is absolutely necessary to mobilize the international community, combining an approach that deals both with civil and political rights, but also with economic, social and cultural rights, and being able to do it with the conviction that human rights are a value in themselves and they shouldn't serve political purposes of any kind, but based on these two principles, mobilizing a new broader alliance for human rights, able to revert this trend that we are witnessing, in which the human rights agenda has been, as I said, losing ground to the national sovereignty agenda and facilitating the life of those that are violating in a horrible way the most basic rights, international humanitarian law, and namely in conflict situations, committing crimes against humanity, war crimes that one would consider should not be possible in the 21st century, but that unfortunately we are witnessing in many of the conflict situations in which we operate. And finally, we need to be able to address the questions of the future. When one thinks about the fourth industrial revolution we are living, it is clear that it will have dramatic impacts in the labor markets. And we know today how unemployment in certain areas of certain countries, and namely youth unemployment, has been a very dramatic factor, both for the well-being of people, for the development perspectives of countries, but also for the international peace and security. Recently, in a survey in relation to fighters in these conflict areas that came back, it was detected that the main reason, of course there are ideological reasons, all kinds of others, but the main reason that led so many young people to go and fight in remote places was the lack of opportunities. And if one sees the levels of youth unemployment in the Middle East, one understands how dangerous this is for us all. Now, looking at the evolution, the technological evolution, one can foresee in the next decades dramatic reduction in jobs in a number of functions that we today consider absolutely impossible to eliminate. Just to give an example, some people say that in a few decades' time there will be no drivers. You can imagine what this impact will have in the labor markets, in the employment situations, and what challenges this will put to governments and to international organizations and to societies in general. This is the kind of area that I believe we need to discuss much more seriously. We need to be able to anticipate the impacts of these changes that probably are inevitable, and to have the adequate policies at social level, at economic level, at international cooperation level, to make sure that this fourth industrial revolution will not become a dramatic factor of insecurity for our societies. And then we have areas that are having an enormous progress, and in which both governments and international organizations have very little capacity to even understand what's happening and to regulate the way these things happen, taking into account that some of them have dramatic impacts even from the ethical point of view. I'm talking about artificial intelligence, I'm talking about genetic engineering and other areas. And one of the important things that we need is to discuss what kind of regulatory mechanism should we have? What is the role of governments? What is the role of international organizations like the UN? So there are a number of issues, frontier issues related to the future that we cannot just forget about. We need to be able to address the challenges of the present, but we need to be able to anticipate the problems of the future and to try to find for them ways of cooperation in which private sector, governments, international organizations can anticipate what might happen if nothing is done, but finding the solutions for the challenges that we could have in the future. And it's enough to see what's happening today in the cyberspace to understand how the level of unregulation of these factors can represent as a threat to our global peace and security. A strong commitment to multilateralism, a strong commitment to international cooperation, a strong commitment to put the people in the center of our concerns, but to do everything that is needed for the people also to feel that we care for them, and that international organizations are not just a way to, I would say, discuss problems, but are an essential tool to address the present problems of mankind, is something in which we all need to be involved. And it's very reassuring for me to be able to have this conversation in the UK, knowing that the UK is and will remain one of the most solid pillars of the UN and one of the most solid pillars of the understanding that there is no solution for global problems without strong multilateral institutions. Thank you very much.
Secretary General, what a privilege to hear you speak. That was a fascinating overview. I'm tempted to forget all the questions that we've had sent in to us and just ask you my own, but I'm not going to do that because we were absolutely inundated with questions that were sent in by people in this room, people who couldn't be here today, by email and on social media. We sadly won't have time to ask the vast majority of them, but I'll do my best to fit in as many as I can, and I'll try and bring in some comments that are coming through all the time on Twitter using the hashtag SGLondon. So in a minute, I'm going to take some questions from the floor. So if Madeleine Crowther, Abigail Reyes, and Nathaniel Chan could please make themselves known to our roving mic assistants, I'll come to you in a second. But first, Secretary General, I'd like to ask you a question about your role. Throughout the selection process, there were calls for the Secretary General to do a huge number of things. Be a peace broker, a voice for the poor, someone who speaks truth to power, a diplomat, the conscience of the world, a hard-headed reformer. These are not functions that are always compatible all the time. And a lot of the questions we receive today are people calling you to speak out. Ujo Okpala would like you to speak out about Nigeria, Saeed Sabtan about Kashmir, Nathaniel Goddard about Gaza. A lot of people would like you to say more about a certain president of the United States. And speaking truth to power repeatedly came up as a key criterion for your job, not only in civil society polls, but also in your dialogue with member states. But of course, you need to work with states and with the powers that be as well. And you don't have any magic powers to compel states to act differently or to support the UN. How do you approach achieving that balance? How do you decide when to speak out?
I don't think I know how to answer this question, no? Because that is the most difficult balance to establish. There is one thing that must be clear for me. The objective is to serve people. The objective is not to have protagonism, or to be in the media, or to be in the news, or to become popular. The objective is to serve people. So I think it's the duty of a Secretary General, that is Secretary General of an intergovernmental organization, to do everything possible to make sure that governments do what they have to do in support of their own people. But it is also true that in some circumstances, when you completely fail on that objective, you will need to speak up, as you said, and to be able to clearly denounce what is wrong. The decision of what is the moment to move from one engagement to a more critical position is a very complex decision. And if I would say that, oh, it's very simple, I would be lying. No, it's a complex decision, and you need, in all situations, to measure it from the point of view of the interests of the people you serve. But sometimes you need to do both. I'll give you an example. Myanmar. No, the situation of the Rohingya community in Myanmar. It is clear for me that we need to engage with the government of Myanmar to improve the conditions of the Rohingya community in Myanmar. If we don't engage with the government, it will never happen. And we know how complex the situation is in Myanmar, between the civilian power and the military power. So this engagement is complex. But at the same time, you need to recognize that the Rohingyas are probably one of the most discriminated communities in the world. And you need to denounce the fact that their human rights are being violated in an horrible way. So how to combine these two approaches is, again, something that is sometimes difficult to measure. But in many circumstances, you need to combine both. But it's not an easy job.
No,
and I have to say that, unfortunately, a lot of the time that one spends in international organizations today is also doing some damage control.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating to have the insight on the sort of million little decisions you have to calibrate every day. So our first question, please, from Madeleine Crowther.
If your priority is prevention, 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 how do you plan to deal with long-running conflicts that no longer inspire the political will needed to restore peace?
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part.
It was, if your priority is prevention, prevention, and prevention, how do you plan to address conflicts that are already in existence, of long-running conflicts where there's a lack of political will? If we can just take the other two questions as well and maybe answer those three, that would be fantastic. So, Abigail Reyes, please.
With Security Council members such as the United States, Russia and China disagreeing about world problems like Syria and North Korea, how can the United Nations avoid just being a bystander?
Okay, the United Nations.
Sure. So the first question about prevention, the second question was, given disagreement within Security Council on problems such as Syria and North Korea, how can the UN avoid being a bystander?
Okay. I think we need to combine a very strong commitment to prevention, and prevention is a multi-pronged approach. Prevention is not only trying to make sure that we organize talks between two parties or a government and a rebel group that might become a violent one. Prevention has a lot to do with the social and economic situation of the country. Prevention has a lot to do with human rights. Violations of human rights are sometimes the first indicator that a conflict is approaching. Prevention has a lot to do with strengthening institutions, strengthening civil society, and strengthening governments and government capacities in some areas. So prevention is building resilience of communities in relation to adaptation to climate change. Prevention is all these things. But at the same time, we need to increase our investment capacity in conflict resolution. And that is where this second question is very important. We have seen in recent times that the Security Council, in relation to crucial aspects of conflicts that are taking place, is not able to come together. We have seen vetoes being expressed, and we have seen a paralysis in the possibility of the Security Council assuming the initiative in relation to the solution of certain conflicts. I would even go further. I think that today the Security Council is only able to fully address a crisis when the countries of the region are united in the way to deal with the crisis. We have seen in Gambia. In Gambia, the crisis, the countries of the region were united in relation to the crisis, and the Security Council could act. But if you look at South Sudan, where there were differences some time ago in relation to the way the countries of the region were looking into a possible solution, there was an attempted resolution in the Security Council on sanctions and embargoes. It didn't go through. I mean, the Security Council was not able to come together. So one of the things that is very important when we try to create the conditions for the UN to be active in conflict resolution today is working a lot in diplomacy, preventive diplomacy and conflict resolution diplomacy with the different countries of the region, the different stakeholders of a conflict. And there is a lot of discreet diplomacy that is necessary beyond what can be done publicly. But for me, one thing is clear. There will only be peace in Syria or in any other of the conflicts we are witnessing when the parties to the conflict understand that they cannot win the war. When the parties to the conflict believe, or one of the parties believe that that party can win the war, it's very difficult. In the present situation, with the paralysis I mentioned of the Security Council, for the international community to stop it. My deep belief is that the wars that we are witnessing today are not winnable. My deep belief is these wars are wars in which everybody is losing. And this is what I've been trying to convince the so-called stakeholders of each conflict, those countries that have an influence on the parties to the conflict. And this is what I hope will be more and more the activity, the diplomatic activity of more and more actors around the world, working with the UN, with other regional organizations, to make those that are involved in conflicts, be it in Syria, be it in Yemen, be it in Libya, be it in South Sudan or wherever, that these conflicts have no possible winner, that only a political solution can solve them, and that it is in the interest of everybody that they are solved. If you look at Syria, Syria is not only today a drama for the Syrian people. Syria was the factor that created an enormous regional instability. We have seen how it has dramatically impacted Iraq, the consequences on Lebanon, the huge impact on the economy and the demographic situation in Jordan, not to mention the complexities now of the Turkish-Kurdish problem linked to the Syrian situation. All these On the other hand, Syria conflict is clearly one of the reasons that is fueling global terrorism everywhere. So I think for all those that have an influence in the parties of the conflict, it's high time to understand that this is a war in which nobody is winning, and this is a war that became a danger for us all. To get to that point is what matters. I have to recognize I'm not yet there.
Thank you very much. Just a quick note to say that SG London is trending on Twitter. It's #1 right now, so please keep your questions coming. And I'm going to change subject a little bit. We had a question from Harriet in Uganda about development and disability. She said, people with disabilities have been left out of development discussions for far too long. How are you going to change that? And before you answer, if we could go to Nathaniel with his question as well. We'll take those two together.
So one of the greatest challenges facing humanity today is a recent surge in nationalism. Einstein famously once described nationalism as an infantile disease, the measles of mankind. Now, I'm a millennial who was born in Hong Kong, raised in Canada, volunteered on 3 continents, and now I'm doing my master's in the UK. I'm sure there's many in the audience like myself who are global citizens. What can we do to combat this trend and create a friendlier world?
So one question on development and disability, and the second question on what can we as global citizens do to combat the trend of nationalism?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to understand that the number of persons with disability in the world is enormous. So we are not talking about something that interests a very small part of the global population. No, we are talking of something that should be in the center of all development strategies, should be in the center of all economic and social policies of all kinds, in education, in health, in urban development, and taking into account the way houses are built, etc. So it is very clear that this must be an enhanced priority. It is also clear that we have not done enough. In the UN, we have not done enough. And this is one of the areas we have selected in order to be able to correct what has been a, I would say, lack of sufficient commitment in the past. Now, I think that the most important contribution that Europe has given to the world civilization has been the values of the Enlightenment. And the values of the Enlightenment are unfortunately being put into question today. Tolerance, the primacy of reason, we see more and more irrational behaviors. And nationalism is one of those irrational behaviors, in the sense that it's not through nationalism that we are going to solve our problems. We are going to solve our problems through dialogue, mutual understanding, and international cooperation. But it's not only nationalism. It's nationalism, it's xenophobia, it's anti-Semitism, it's anti-Muslim hatred. We are seeing the development of these kind of feelings in our society, and this is something we need to fight. But it's not enough to fight it ideologically. It's not enough to say this is wrong. I think we need to look into the root causes of that. And many of those root causes are in the fact that I mentioned when I was speaking a few minutes ago, the fact that many people felt left behind. Many people felt that globalization had undermined their interests. Then an irrational approach to what we have witnessed in recent times in relation to the massive movements of population, to the idea that we can be threatened in our identity, that foreigners are coming and are going to change us. And the only way to solve this problem is investing in societies, investing in the social cohesion of societies, the inclusiveness of societies, making in societies that are all multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, and the British society is a fantastic example of that. I mean, you have, in this room, we can see that expression in a very eloquent way. But it would be a mistake to think that harmony can happen spontaneously and naturally. No, an investment is necessary to make each group feel that its identity is respected, but to make also each group feel that they belong to the community, that they are part of the community and are binded by the values of the community as a whole. So I think that in our societies there is still a lot to be done in order to make sure that we address the root causes of this kind of behaviors, be it aggressive nationalism, xenophobia, or different forms of radicalization against this or that group. This is something in which we need to think in the way the software of our society is organized and in the way you create the conditions for difference to be understood, for difference to be respected, and also for those that are different to respect each other.
I'm sorry, we have pre-submitted questions. I'm afraid we can't. Sorry,
the question was?
The question was, in Burma, is genocide happening in your opinion? Is there any genocide happening in Burma? Another Holocaust repeating?
Thank you. We've got your question on Burma.
I think that there is in Myanmar a very serious problem with several communities that is known. And the main concern that I've been expressing is in relation to the Rohingya community, and I hope that there will be a way in which it will be possible for that community to see their rights respected in the context of Myanmar.
So I think you've had your question. Thanks very much. I'm going to go to Sanduni Mudianzi next. So please could the mic get to her. But I just wanted to stay actually on the theme of nationalism because we had so many questions on the theme from Jama Noor, Pranav Joshi, Stephen Marshall, Camilla Adams, Hilmi Kozioglu. And you're not going to be surprised that Brexit came up as a theme as well. It seems as though many countries, though, and I don't just want to talk about the UK here, are going through a process of recalibrating their relationship with the world, with each other. Something like a midlife crisis for states, maybe. But in the past, these sort of global power shifts have proved quite dangerous. So I wanted to ask how the UN will approach the challenge of a world that is increasingly multipolar and polarized.
Well, first of all, I think we need to be careful when we mix everything. No, I don't mix Brexit. That was a discussion among the British people, whether or not Britain should remain in the European Union. And this was a decision that the British people took. And there are arguments in favor and arguments against. And now the British government and the British people will have in dialogue with the European Union to find a way to make it happen. We shouldn't make that comparison of this thing with what is the expression of nationalism in situations in which that nationalism is an aggressive form that leads to conflict. I mean, I think we need to separate things, because if we start mixing everything, we will not be able to get to the conclusions that we want. But what it is for me clear is that there is today in the world a lot of anger of many people because they see progress, they see wealth, they see people living extremely well, and they feel left behind. And I think this is the factor that generates the largest number of these irrational behaviors. And the levels of inequality in the world have tremendously increased. I think if one compares, I think the 8 richest people in the world have more than 50% of the world population. And so when people are aware of these things, and especially in areas where there are high levels of unemployment, these kind of feelings tend to emerge. There is only one way to avoid it, is to address these problems, is to make these people understand that governments, international organizations care about them and try to develop the programs, be it of training, be it of job creation, be it of different forms of social policy, to address the problems that they have. Because if not, it will be natural for us to witness the emergence of this kind of expressions. So we need to fight against xenophobia, we need to fight against anti-Semitism, we need to fight against anti-Muslim hatred, but we need to be able to address, it's not enough to blame people, we need to be able to address the root causes of this phenomenon, and the UN needs to play a positive role in that, mobilizing societies, mobilizing countries for those problems to be effectively handled and effectively tackled.
Sandrine? Yes.
Sorry,
The question was, I think in a nutshell, does the UN Charter need an update because it was written over 70 years ago?
I have to say that the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Refugee Convention that I was taking care of when I was in UNHCR, I believe that if they were written today, they would probably become worse than what they are. So I would be very careful. I would be very careful in trying to change a number of texts that were drafted and approved in a very special moment in the history of mankind, that because of the horrors of the Second World War led people to really think seriously about the solutions we need to be able to live in peace. So I wouldn't touch the UN Charter. You were mentioning in your last question about multipolarity. And there is here one thing I would like to say. Some people have the illusion that when we moved from a bipolar world to a unipolar world, and we are now looking as if we are moving to a multipolar world, even if for the moment it's more chaotic than anything else, the idea that a multipolar world by itself will solve all problems, that it brings equilibrium and equilibrium harmony. I would like to remind you that Europe before the First World War was a multipolar continent, but without multilateral governance institutions. And the result was the First World War. So when we look at the multipolar world that slowly is being built, that is one reason more for the importance to strengthen multilateral forms of governance. And this is, I think, a very important argument in the discussion that we are having today.
I think that actually leads quite well to our next question. We ran a competition on Twitter, and the winner was chosen to ask their question today, and it's Louison Mazot. So if the mic could go to her, and also to Zenaida Anem for our, I think, unfortunately, our final question before we have to wrap up. So Louison?
Sorry, thank you for being here. Often, the responsibilities of member states are misunderstood by the public opinion as failures from the UN corporate body as a whole. So my question is, what is your strategy against increasingly common UN bashing narratives? Thank you.
Member states.
What is your strategy against the sort of UN bashing narratives when people focus on, the UN having failed when actually possibly it's, member states' responsibility?
It's a very difficult strategy. It's a very difficult question. I'll give you an example. You remember many years ago there was a bombing bombardments in Lebanon, no? And there was a discussion in the Security Council whether or not those bombardments should be stopped. Now, independently now of the merits of what was being discussed, our UNHCR at the time, UNHCR staff in Lebanon was trying to help people with the UN shirts, and they were accused by the population of the decisions of the Security Council. I mean, blamed by the population of the decisions of the Security Council. it's very difficult to make this distinction. I mean, for the general public, people will look at the UN and see the UN. The fact is, one thing is Security Council, another thing is General Assembly, another thing is UNICEF, or the World Food Programme, or UNDP, or the Secretariat, or the peacekeeping forces. But one of the challenges we have is that the UN, in its complexity, generates many situations in which problems cannot be solved because member states are not in agreement, and the UN is blamed for that. What we need is to do everything possible to make the UN more effective and to make member states more able to come together and to overcome their differences, especially when the problems we face are so dramatic that indeed the contradictions of interest that exist among states in the majority of the situations I've witnessed, even when a paralysis occurs, it's my deep belief that there are more reasons for countries to unite than for countries to oppose each other.
And Zenaida for the final question. That wasn't Zenaida, but we can have a question if you want to answer on Iran before the mic goes to Zenaida. I'm very sorry, sir. We really don't have time for more questions. It would be fantastic if you
the UN has a number of very important instruments in relation to that. First of all, the UN has been involved consistently in a campaign against death penalty, and I come from the country, we believe we were the first to abolish death penalty, and I think it's very important that we all engage in abolishing death penalty, that nothing can justify in no circumstances whatsoever. But the UN has some very important instruments in relation to the protection of human rights. We have a High Commissioner for Human Rights that has been quite outspoken in many situations. We have a Human Rights Council that, with all the differences among states, has played a very important role. And indeed, in many situations, the UN has been able to limit and in some circumstances even to punish through the International Criminal Court violations of human rights. We have also the problem, as we know, that the International Criminal Court cannot act in all circumstances. It depends either of countries being members of the court or of a Security Council decision. But in any case, we have to recognize that many dramatic situations where human rights are violated have been positively addressed. Not all, not in all circumstances. Sometimes the different perspectives of key member states do not allow to go as far as we would like, but the commitment to human rights in all its dimensions is absolutely crucial in the life of the UN.
Thank you very much for answering that, and I hope we do actually now have Zenaida who is going to answer the question. Please give the mic to Zenaida and over to you for the final question. Thank you very much. Please, it would be very nice if you respected our questioner, please, who's come a long way to ask this question today.
What advice would you give young people such as myself who want to make a positive impact on the world but feel that there's a lack of platforms for us to share our ideas?
So we have a lot of young people in the audience, about 50% of the audience is under 30, and Zenaida wanted to know what advice you'd give to young people who want to make an impact, but who find it very difficult to know what to do, how to have a platform to sort of share and discuss ideas and take action.
I think one of the crucial questions for the reform of political establishments in general and for the reform of international organizations is how to give adequate voice to young people and how to empower young people in the way organizations operate. We have not solved that problem. Sometimes we have a ridiculous situation to have elderly stateswomen or statesmen being envoys for young people. No? And I can even give you examples in the UN where that has happened. One of the things we are discussing today is what kind of mechanism can we establish instead of just convening a ministerial conference to discuss the problems of youth? what kind of mechanisms can we create, especially taking profit of technology and of social networks and others, to allow for this permanent interaction between young people organized around the world and the UN itself. The philosopher that has more influence in my own thinking is a German philosopher called Habermas. And Habermas has many contributions, but one of the ideas that I find more inspiring in Habermas is that a very important character in a modern democracy is the permanent flow of intercommunication between the civil society and the political society, and the fact that this permanent flow of intercommunication has an influence on political decisions, not only through elections every 4 or 5 years. Now, how to establish this permanent flow of communication between young people in general that are less organized in the formal civil society and political organizations and international organizations is something we have not yet been able to put in place. Because obviously the mechanisms of communication need to be different from the traditional ones and need to use much more technology, social media, etc. We are not yet there. Just to give you an idea how we are not there, in the UN there are 56 people working in the headquarters, working with radio, and 3 with social media. This shows how organizations are still living in another age of communication, and how that fact undermines the capacity to engage with young people that today has a completely different way to relate with these new forms of communication and new technologies. We have not solved that problem, and this is in the center of our present discussions in the Executive Committee of the Secretariat.
Thank you. And just one last question from me, actually. We've spoken about a lot of pretty depressing things today and noted some trends that aren't so positive. You've been very good about telling us, giving us examples of things that are going well. What message would you give us to make us sort of put a smile on our face? What gives us hope? What motivates you when you're at work thinking this is a good thing that's happening at the moment?
I have to say that still nothing has had more impact on me than the work I have done 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees. And to see people that has fled conflict in dramatic situations, that has lost everything, that has seen members of the family being killed, that has fled and drowned in the Mediterranean or whatever, and to see their courage, their commitment, their resilience, and their hope in the future is something that I can never forget, and is basically the reason why I became a candidate for Secretary General of the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Thank you very much. It's well-deserved applause. Thank you very much, Secretary General. You've been incredibly generous with your time and your answers. And I'm very sorry to everyone. We cannot, unfortunately, ask the Secretary General about every single country situation in the world. I'm very sorry, Madam. I'm very sorry that we didn't get to all the questions. Unfortunately, we are now running out of time, but I just want to thank the Secretary General to stay here for a moment, for giving us so much food for thought and action. Once again, I am sorry, but we can't possibly ask the Secretary General to comment on every single member state of the UN. We just don't have time for that. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say, once again, big thanks to the Secretary General. It's a real privilege to us to have hosted your first big speech in the UK. Please do come back. As you can see, people are dying to ask you questions. To Baroness Anley and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, we are so grateful to you for all your support for this event. To Central Hall Westminster, it's always a pleasure to work with you on bringing the UN home to London. And to my brilliant UNA UK team, thank you for all your hard work. You've worked wonders and blood, sweat and tears for this event. You have succeeded as ever in making people think we are not a tiny cash-strapped organization, but we are a tiny cash-strapped organization. So ladies and gentlemen, before you leave, please do take a look at the donation card you received with your program and consider supporting us. We are the only charity in the UK that makes the case for an effective UN to policymakers and the public. This work has never been more important. We increasingly find ourselves having to defend very basic fundamental values and principles, that we should have compassion for refugees, that human rights protect us all, that we need to work together to solve global problems, and that in this interconnected world, we are all global citizens, whether we like it or not. So do help us and consider making a donation, which you can drop into the buckets held by volunteers on your way out. And thank you all for coming. You've demonstrated that you do really, really care what's going on in the world. We'll be writing to you after this event with more information on how you can get involved with us, including with our Manifesto for Global Britain, which we've released this week. Those of you who are wearing a black sticker, please leave the hall as you came in and follow the signs at the bottom of the stairs. Our volunteers will guide you. And finally, Secretary General, we offer you our warmest wishes for your term. No pressure, but the world needs you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the Secretary General once again.